Welcome to BeFM Drama, where we turn great works of English literature into gripping radio. I'm your host, Joshua Cornwell, and today we're bringing you part 2 of The Adventure of the Empty House, a classic Sherlock Holmes mystery from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The great detective Sherlock Holmes has been presumed dead for 3 years following the final battle with his nemesis, Moriarty. During that time, his old friend, Dr. Watson, now a widower, has maintained an interest in crime. All of London has been transfixed by the mysterious death of Ronald Adair, a young nobleman inexplicably killed by a revolver bullet in an empty, locked room, and Watson has done his best to make sense of the crime. As we return to the story, a mysterious bookseller Dr. Watson encountered near the scene of the crime calls on his house asking to speak with him. The wizened bookseller set his collection of books down on my table and spoke to me in a strange, croaking voice.
"You're surprised to see me, sir?"
I acknowledged that I was.
"Well, I've a conscience, sir, and when I chanced to see you go into this house as I came hobbling after you, I thought to myself, I'll just step in and see that kind gentleman and tell him that if I was a bit gruff in my manner, there wasn't any harm meant, and that I am much obliged to him for picking up my books."
You make too much of a trifle. May I ask how you knew who I was?
"Well, sir, if it isn't too great a liberty, I am a neighbour of yours and very happy to see you, I am sure. Maybe you collect books yourself, sir. Here's British Birds and Catullus and the Holy War, a bargain every one of them. Why, with 5 volumes you could just fill that gap on that second shelf. It looks untidy, does it not, sir?"
I moved my head to look at the cabinet behind me. When I turned again, Sherlock Holmes was standing smiling at me across my study table. I rose to my feet, stared at him for some seconds in utter amazement, and then it appears that I must have fainted for the first and last time in my life. A gray mist swirled before my eyes, and when it cleared, I found my collar ends undone and the tingling aftertaste of brandy upon my lips. Holmes was bending over my chair, his flask in his hand.
"My dear Watson, I owe you 1,000 apologies. I had no idea you would be so affected."
Holmes, is it really you? Can it indeed be that you are alive? Is it possible that you succeeded in climbing out of that awful waterfall?
Wait a moment, are you sure you're really fit to discuss things? I've given you a serious shock by my unnecessarily dramatic reappearance.
I am all right. But indeed, Holmes, I can hardly believe my eyes. Good heavens, to think that you of all men, should be standing in my study. I gripped him by the sleeve and felt the thin, sinewy arm beneath it. "Well, you're not a spirit anyhow. My dear chap, I'm overjoyed to see you. Sit down and tell me how you came alive out of that dreadful chasm." He sat opposite me in his old, nonchalant manner. He was dressed in the seedy frock coat of the book merchant, but the rest of that individual lay in a pile of white hair and old books upon the table. Holmes looked even thinner and keener than of old, but there was a dead white tinge in his aquiline face which told me that his life recently had not been a healthy one.
"Oh, I'm glad to stretch myself, Watson. It is no joke when a tall man has to fake a foot off his height for several hours on end. Now, my dear fellow, in the matter of these explanations, we have, if I may ask for your cooperation, a hard and dangerous night's work in front of us. Perhaps it would be better if I gave you an account of the whole situation when that work is finished."
I am full of curiosity. I should much prefer to hear it now.
"You'll come with me tonight?"
When you like and where you like.
"This is indeed like the old days. We shall have time for a mouthful of dinner before we have to go. Well then, about that chasm. I had no serious difficulty getting out of it, for the very simple reason that I was never in it."
You were never in it?
No, Watson, I was never in it. The note I wrote to you was absolutely genuine. I had little doubt that I had come to the end of my career when I perceived the sinister figure of the late Professor Moriarty standing upon the narrow pathway which led to safety. I read a deadly purpose in his grey eyes. I exchanged some remarks with him and obtained his courteous permission to write the short note which you afterwards received. I left it with my cigarette box and my stick, and I walked along the pathway. Moriarty at my heels. When I reached the end, I stood at bay. He drew no weapon, but he rushed at me and threw his long arms around me. He knew that his own game was up, and was only anxious to revenge himself upon me. We tottered together upon the brink of the fall. I have some knowledge, however, of judo, the Japanese system of wrestling, which has more than once been very useful to me. I slipped through his grip, and he, with a horrible scream, kicked madly for a few seconds and clawed the air with both hands. For all his efforts, he could not get his balance, and over he went. With my face over the brink, I saw him fall for a long way. Then he struck a rock, bounded off, and splashed into the water.
I listened with amazement to this explanation. But the tracks! I saw with my own eyes that 2 went down the path and none returned.
It came about this way. The instant that the professor disappeared, it struck me what a really extraordinarily lucky chance fate had placed in my way. I knew that Moriarty was not the only man who had sworn my death. There were at least 3 others whose desire for vengeance upon me would only be increased by the death of their leader. They were all dangerous men. One or another would certainly get me. On the other hand, if all the world was convinced that I was dead, they would take liberties, these men, and sooner or later I could destroy them. Then it would be time to announce that I was still in the land of the living. So rapidly does the brain act that I believe I had thought all of this out before Professor Moriarty had reached the bottom of the Reichenbach Fall. I stood up and examined the rocky wall behind me. In your picturesque account of the matter, which I read with great interest some months later, you wrote that the wall was sheer. It was not literally true. A few small footholds presented themselves, and there was some indication of a ledge. I decided it was best to risk the climb. It was not a pleasant business, Watson. The falls roared beneath me. I'm not a fanciful person, but I give you my word that I seemed to hear Moriarty's voice screaming at me out of the abyss. A mistake would have been fatal. More than once as tufts of grass came out in my hand or foot slipped in the wet notches of the rock, I thought that I was gone. But I struggled upward, and at last I reached a ledge several feet deep and covered in soft green moss, where I could lie unseen in the most perfect comfort. There I was stretched, when you, my dear Watson, were investigating in the most sympathetic and inefficient manner the circumstances of my death.
You mean to say that the whole time I cried out for you and wept for you, you were lying there on the ledge above me, watching everything?
Oh, indeed so. And a most affecting display it was. At last, when you had formed your inevitable and totally erroneous conclusion, you departed for the hotel, and I was left alone. I'd imagined that I had reached the end of my adventures, but a very unexpected occurrence showed me that there were still surprises in store. A huge rock, falling from above, boomed past me and bounded into the chasm. For an instant, I thought that it was an accident, but a moment later, looking up, I saw a man's head against the darkening sky, and another stone struck upon the very ledge upon which I lay. Of course, the meaning of this was obvious. Moriarty had not been alone. A Confederate, and even that one glance told me how dangerous a man that Confederate was, had kept guard while the professor had attacked me. From a distance, unseen by me, he had witnessed his friend's death and my escape. He had waited, and then made his way around to the top of the cliff where he tried to succeed where Moriarty had failed. I didn't have long to think about it, Watson. Again, I saw that grim face look over the cliff, and I knew that another stone would soon follow. I scrambled down onto the path. I don't think I could have done it if I hadn't been in fear for my life. It was 100 times more difficult going down than getting up. But I had no time to think of the danger, for another stone sang past me as I hung by my hands from the edge of the ledge. Halfway down I slipped, but by the blessing of God I landed, torn and bleeding upon the path. I took to my heels, ran 10 miles over the mountain in the darkness, and a week later I found myself in Florence with the certainty that no one in the world knew what had become of me.
Sherlock Sherlock Holmes has returned from the dead, revealing to his stunned old friend Dr. Watson that his 3-year disappearance was necessary to ensure that he could avoid the remnants of Moriarty's gang, who are eager to avenge their former leader's death. But why has Holmes now returned to London? Is the inexplicable death of the young nobleman Ronald Adair somehow connected with Holmes's decision to reveal himself to Watson? Find out tomorrow evening as we bring you part 3 in our adaptation of The Adventure of the Empty House here on BeFM Drama.